heard the story from the midstream media about the shooting of Army recruits, but what they aren't talking about is the shooter's strong ties to radical Islam. Robert Spencer with Jihad Watch has been investigating the story and joins us now.
Michael, thank you for having me on to talk about this. The mainstream media has once again dropped the ball. They are not giving this story much attention, and that is really ironic in light of the shooting of the abortionist George Tiller, which has gotten enormous mainstream media coverage, as well as a message from the President of the United States. The President of the United States has not seen fit to issue any statement about the shooting of a U.S. military man by an Islamic jihadist in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I think that in itself is very noteworthy, but the indifference of the mainstream media in general is also not only noteworthy, but really kind of unsurprising in a sense, because, of course, they have always tended to downplay, ignore, minimize examples of Islamic jihad. And this is a clear Islamic terrorist attack on American soil, no less unmistakable than 9/11, although, of course, on a much smaller scale. One soldier is dead, another is wounded, and they were shot at by a Muslim convert who explained that he was doing it because he was angry with what the United States was doing in Muslim countries. He had maps in his home of Jewish organizations, a Baptist church, a child care center, a post office, and military recruiting centers in the southeastern United States, New York and Philadelphia. He studied in Yemen, and very interestingly, he went to Yemen on a passport from Somalia. And he's not a Somali. He's a black American convert to Islam, but he somehow obtained a Somali passport, which is noteworthy in light of all the stories that you may recall of Somali immigrants in the Minneapolis area in particular suddenly disappearing. And at least one of them was found in Somalia when he exploded himself in a suicide attack there. And there is some indication that Somalis have returned there to wage jihad at the invitation of jihadist groups, at the call of jihadist groups to Somali immigrants around the world. And concern also that since some of them have now trained with al-Qaeda, that they will come back and bring their jihad here. In any case, this fellow, Abdul Hakim Muhammad, his middle name that he took when he changed his name from Carlos Bledsoe was Mujahid, which is warrior of jihad. And that in itself is also quite interesting and has not been noted by the mainstream media. But in any case, he was in Yemen on a Somali passport, was arrested for being there on this passport, apparently on false pretenses. He had gone there in order to study with an Islamist sheikh named Yahya Hajuri. And Abdul Hakim Muhammad wanted to study with him because he was well known to be a preacher of violence, of a very virulent form of Islam. It's not known whether he actually studied with Hajuri himself once he got there, or whether he studied with one of his students. But in any case, he came back, and there was enough concern about him at that point that the Joint Terrorism Task Force began to follow him and to investigate him. But obviously, they were not quite as hot on his trail as we might have wished that they had been.
Well, what do we know about his conversion to Islam?
Well, we know that, for one thing, as it's been widely stated that he was converted in prison, and we know that there's a lot of jihadist recruitment in American prisons, and that for a long time the Islamic Society of North America was proving chaplains for the American prison system, which is really ironic since the Islamic Society of North America is linked to the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a group that in its own words wants to eliminate and destroy Western civilization from within and sabotage its miserable house. And the Islamic Society of North America was also listed as an unindicted co-conspirator in a Hamas terror funding case a couple years back. And so this is the group that's sending chaplains into prison. It's no wonder that we see jihadists coming out of prison. Abdul Hakim Muhammad is not one of them. He was not converted in prison. He was converted by American, and I actually have a manual for making converts that was printed by Muslims and for Muslims in the United States on how to preach to non-Muslims in the United States, and it actually specifically says that the revolutionary aspects of the religion should be withheld from the prospective convert until he becomes a Muslim. And then you start telling him about the jihad and jihad violence and Islamic supremacism once he's already in and his loyalty is captured. Now, did Abdul Hakim Muhammad follow this path? We don't have all the details yet, but we do know that he was a student, a business major at Tennessee State University, and that as soon as he converted, he left school and ultimately made his way to Yemen. He was clearly under the influence of Muslims who were tied into jihad groups and convinced him that that was the way to go.
What do you think of the chances of the mainstream media picking up this story?
Well, it seems already that the mainstream media is not at all interested in picking it up. There have been stories here and there, but it's not gotten anything like the play that the murder of George Tiller has gotten. It's also interesting to note that people like Keith Olbermann and others have not hesitated to link the murder of George Tiller to Christianity, whereas they would be among the first to be very upset if anybody were to link the actions of Abdul Hakim Muhammad to Islam. And yet the connection between the two is much stronger in the case of Abdul Hakim Muhammad than it is in the case of the murder of Tiller, because as we know, all the pro-life groups and all the Christian groups have condemned this killing. They do not condone this kind of activity, whereas in Islam, the situation is not that simple. There are condemnations of terrorism, but they are generally vaguely worded, leave all kinds of loopholes open, and they unfortunately do not contradict the fact that all the sects and schools of Islamic jurisprudence teach that Muslims must wage war against unbelievers and ultimately subjugate them under the rule of Islamic law. And so if Abdul Hakim Muhammad was imbibing that kind of teaching, then it's not in the least surprising that he would turn violent.
Thanks for the report, Robert. This is the Savage Nation. Be here or be nowhere.
Savage.